Hey everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into something I know a lot of you have been asking about. We're talking about criminal justice. Specifically, how can we as Christians think about the criminal justice system? How can we even engage with it?
It's a huge topic.
It really is. Where do you even begin? Well, thankfully, we've got a guide for this deep dive.
That's right.
We're going to be looking at Christian Martens and his book, Reforming Criminal Justice, A Christian Perspective.
Yeah, Martens has a ton of experience. Over 25 years in criminal law.
That's right, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney.
Which is so valuable for us.
Right.
Because he really has that.
Both sides.
Yeah, he's seen both sides of the coin. He's even worked on capital murder cases.
Yeah, so talk about...
He knows what he's talking about.
Exactly, he knows what he's talking about. So one of the first things that Martens does in this book is he kind of tackles this idea of social justice.
Yeah, and I love how he approaches this. He points out that the term itself has become really politically charged.
Right.
And can be associated with certain ideologies.
Yeah.
But he argues that the fundamental desire for a more just society,
right,
that is deeply rooted in the gospel.
It is.
So it's not something we can just dismiss as a political talking point.
Okay, so how do we then connect that to our lives,
right,
to the choices we make, to how we engage?
Yeah, how do we as individuals contribute to a more just world?
Right.
Martens challenges us to really look inward and examine our own biases, our own assumptions, and, to really consider how we might be complicit in injustice.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to just kind of sit back and critique it, but Martens is really challenging us to think deeper about how we participate in it.
Absolutely. And he reminds us of something really crucial, that the criminal justice system, at its core, relies on force.
Right. The state's power to use force.
Yeah. And that creates kind of a tension for Christians. We're called to be peacemakers.
Yeah.
To love our enemies.
To turn the other cheek.
Right. But then we're also part of a system that uses force, sometimes even violence, to maintain order.
Yeah.
So it's a real paradox.
It is a paradox, and it's one that I know a lot of us grapple with. Now, Martens actually suggests that use of force can be justified from a Christian perspective, but only under very specific conditions.
So it's not about just saying any use of force is okay.
Right. He actually, he points to Romans 13, where Paul talks about submitting to governing authorities.
Right, that passage.
And Martens' argument here is that the government's use of force, to be legitimate, has to be motivated by love.
Oh.
Both love for the victim and even love for the offender.
That's interesting.
It can't be about revenge.
It's not about
just getting even.
Punishing for the sake of punishing.
Right. It's got to be more about protecting the innocent and restoring right relationships.
Restoring right relationships, yeah.
Right.
That's really key.
And just punishing wrongdoing.
Yeah, he even goes on to say that sometimes if the system is so broken that it can't achieve those goals.
Yeah.
That Christians might be morally obligated to walk away from it.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is a strong statement.
It really is.
Yeah,
it makes you really think about
the limits of reform.
Yeah, the limits of reform and what it truly means to live out your faith in a complex world.
Absolutely.
Okay, so to help us navigate all of this, Martens gives us what he calls these essentials for a just system.
Yeah, kind of like a measuring stick.
Yeah.
To evaluate any criminal justice system.
Exactly, and he gives us 5 of them.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those.
Right, the first one is accuracy. The system has to be able to correctly identify and punish the guilty while protecting the innocent.
Okay, so that seems pretty obvious.
Well, the surface, yeah.
But
it's more complicated.
Not so simple.
Than it sounds. Think about, flawed evidence or bias in an investigation. That's where his second principle comes in, due process.
Okay.
Having fair procedures to make sure that accuracy is even possible.
So it's not just about getting a conviction, but getting it the right way?
Absolutely. The process matters.
Okay, what's number 3?
Number 3 is impartiality.
Okay.
Justice has to be blind, right? It shouldn't matter who you are, where you come from. Everyone deserves equal treatment under the law.
No special favors for the wealthy or well-connected?
No, absolutely not.
What's number 4?
Accountability.
Okay.
This one acknowledges that the system is going to fail.
It will fail.
And when it does,
yeah,
those responsible need to be held accountable.
Regardless of who they are.
Exactly. No one's above the law.
Okay, so we've got accuracy, due process, impartiality, accountability.
And the 5th one.
What's number 5?
Proportionality.
Okay.
The punishment needs to fit the crime.
Right. Not be driven by vengeance or be excessive in any way.
Yeah, it's not about revenge, it's about justice.
So we've got these 5 principles: accuracy, due process, impartiality, accountability, proportionality. So the question is, how does the American criminal justice system, how does it measure up against these? Does it pass the test?
Martens calls it a mixed bag,
Yeah.
which I think is a fair assessment.
Yeah.
He points out both strengths and weaknesses.
So let's talk about those. What are some of the areas where Martin sees the system failing?
Well, he starts by looking at plea bargaining,
Okay.
which he says, it's necessary
Mhm.
in a system that's so overloaded.
Right.
But he also expresses concern about the pressure it puts on defendants to plead guilty.
Even if they're innocent.
Yeah, even if they're innocent, just to avoid a harsher sentence.
So it's like prioritizing expediency over justice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, what else?
He also talks about false confessions.
False confessions. So you're telling me that people will confess to crimes
I know, it's disturbing, right?
that they didn't commit.
Yes. And Martens points out that these confessions are often extracted under immense pressure.
Yeah.
Or through these kind of deceptive interrogation tactics.
Okay, that's really unsettling.
It is.
So we've got plea bargaining, false confessions, anything else?
He also talks about the death penalty
Oh, okay.
and how it's a particularly complex issue.
Yeah, that one always brings a lot of debate.
Always.
Yeah.
And he says there are strong arguments on both sides, even within the Christian community.
Yeah, so he's not giving us a simple answer. He's really asking us to wrestle with the complexity of this.
Yeah, to think critically about it, to pray about it.
And really consider how our faith informs our views on these things.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the kind of problem areas that Martin sees. But are there any bright spots? Are there things that the system gets right?
He does point to some positive developments. For example, he starts by emphasizing the importance of understanding the system's history, especially the legacy of slavery and racial discrimination in America.
Right, so you can't fix a problem without understanding its roots.
Exactly. We have to know where we've been to know where we're going.
So where do we go from there?
Well, he highlights some positive things. He talks about the right to counsel for the poor.
Okay.
Which he sees as a crucial aspect of due process. But he also acknowledges that that right is often undermined by things like inadequate funding and overburdened public defenders.
Right, so it's kind of a step in the right direction, but still needs work.
Yeah, it's a work in progress.
Okay, what else?
He also discusses the role of forensic science.
Okay.
Which he says, can be a powerful tool for justice. But he also warns about the potential for it to be misused or misinterpreted.
Right.
And that can lead to wrongful convictions.
So even science isn't perfect.
No, it's still a human endeavor, and we have to be cautious.
Okay, now, where does he see things going wrong?
Well, he's pretty critical of things like mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws, which he argues can lead to these excessively harsh punishments. That don't really align with that principle of proportionality. He also points to jury selection as an area where bias, both conscious and unconscious, can have a significant impact.
Right, and that makes me think about all of the recent high-profile cases where jury selection has become a huge
issue.
Point of contention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Martens is really asking us to be vigilant.
Yes.
To make sure the system is serving justice and not perpetuating injustice.
Absolutely. And he's not just concerned about the big systemic issues. He's also concerned about the human stories within the system.
Right.
The individual lives that are impacted.
He wants us to see the faces behind the statistics.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's not just an abstract legal concept.
Yeah.
It's about real people.
Yeah.
Real lives.
Right. With real consequences.
And, I think that's a really important reminder for all of us. So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm really curious to hear more about Martin's suggestions for how we as Christians
what can we do?
Can actually engage with this.
Yeah.
What can we do? He obviously is passionate about this. Does he offer any practical steps we can take?
He does. He actually devotes a whole section of the book to exploring what he calls a biblical ethic of criminal justice.
Okay, I think we need to dive into that.
Yeah.
In part 2.
All right.
This is getting really interesting.
Yeah, this is good stuff. He actually devotes a whole section of the book to exploring what he calls a biblical ethic of criminal justice.
Okay, so what does that even mean? A biblical ethic of criminal justice. I mean, it sounds a little intimidating, to be honest.
Yeah, it can seem like that, but Martens actually breaks it down in a way that's really accessible.
Okay.
He starts by reminding us that God himself is a God of justice, and that this concern for fairness, for protecting the vulnerable, and holding wrongdoers accountable.
Yeah.
You see that throughout the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And he argues that these principles should really inform how we understand criminal justice today.
So we can't just look at our current laws and systems in isolation.
Right.
We need to see them through the lens of Scripture.
Exactly.
Ground our understanding in something deeper, more timeless.
Yeah, he's calling for a framework that goes beyond just our current cultural context.
So give me some examples. Like, what are some of the specific passages that Martens highlights?
Well, he starts in Deuteronomy,
Okay.
which really emphasizes the importance of due process
Okay.
and the need for multiple witnesses to establish guilt.
Right. So, like, making sure you're not just condemning someone
Exactly.
based on hearsay.
Yeah, there's this real concern for accuracy, for making sure that innocent people aren't wrongly condemned.
And I feel like that's so relevant today.
It is.
With all the wrongful convictions that have come to light, often because of flawed evidence or unreliable eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many innocent people might be behind bars right now.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
It is.
Okay, so Deuteronomy, what else?
He also points to Proverbs,
Okay.
which talks about the importance of wisdom and discernment when you're judging a case.
Okay.
So it's not just about blindly applying the letter of the law.
Right.
It's about understanding the context,
Yeah.
the motivations, the potential consequences of your decisions.
So it's not just about being tough on crime.
Right.
It's about being just and compassionate.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the human impact of every decision.
And that makes me think of that quote.
Which one?
You know, justice without mercy is just brutality.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It really speaks to this idea that justice needs to be tempered with mercy, with an understanding of people's stories.
Absolutely. And Martens goes even further. He actually argues that punishment should be restorative,
Okay.
not just punitive.
So not just about inflicting pain,
Right.
but about actually trying to make things right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He challenges that whole eye for an eye mentality.
Right.
And says that true justice is about seeking the good of everyone involved.
Even the offender.
Even the offender, yeah.
I mean, that's a tough one.
It is.
Especially when we're talking about crimes that have caused a lot of pain and suffering.
Yeah, it goes against our natural instincts.
Right. Our instinct is for revenge.
Yeah, we want to see the person who hurt us suffer.
But Martens is saying we need to rise above that.
Mm-hmm.
As Christians, we're called to a higher standard.
A standard of love and forgiveness.
And redemption. Exactly. So even for someone who's done something terrible, there's still hope.
There's always hope.
There's still the possibility of change.
That's the beauty of the gospel.
And Martens reminds us that we see that theme of redemption throughout the New Testament as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about Jesus' teachings,
Yeah.
about loving our neighbors and even loving our enemies.
Wow. I mean, loving your enemy, that's tough enough in everyday life. Let alone when we're talking about the criminal justice system.
Yeah. But Martens argues that that same radical love should extend to those who have committed crimes.
So he sees the criminal justice system not just as a system of punishment,
Right.
but as an opportunity for redemption and restoration.
It's about seeing the humanity in everyone,
Yeah.
even those who have done wrong.
And recognizing their potential for change.
Absolutely.
This is a lot to take in, this whole idea of a biblical ethic of criminal justice.
It is.
But I have to say, I'm really appreciating Martens' approach.
Yeah.
It's not just like he's throwing out opinions or theories.
He's backing it up.
He's grounding it in Scripture.
Yeah.
He's really making me rethink some of my own assumptions. And he doesn't stop at the biblical principles.
He goes deeper.
He also delves into the history of criminal justice.
Yeah, the whole evolution of it.
From its roots in English common law to how it developed here in the U.S.
Highlighting both the progress that's been made and the challenges that still remain.
So understanding where we've been to know where we need to go.
Exactly.
What are some of the key historical moments he focuses on?
Well, he starts with the American Revolution,
Okay.
emphasizing how concerned the colonists were about due process.
Mm.
And they really rejected that idea of arbitrary rule.
Right. They wanted a system that was fair and just.
Exactly. And Martens argues that you see this commitment to individual rights.
Yeah.
And the principle of equality before the law reflected in the Declaration of Independence.
Which is something we often take for granted.
We do.
But it's important to remember that those rights weren't just given to us.
They were hard-won.
They were fought for,
Yeah.
and they continue to be challenged even today.
Absolutely. And Martens doesn't shy away from the darker chapters in our history either.
Right, he talks about slavery.
Yeah, the legacy of slavery.
And its impact on the criminal justice system.
It's a tough but necessary conversation.
It is, because we can't just pretend that the past doesn't affect us today.
And he argues that racial bias continues to shape the system.
In really profound ways.
Yeah, even though there's been progress since the Civil War.
So the past isn't really past.
It's still with us.
It still haunts us.
And he traces that impact through the development of Jim Crow laws and the rise of mass incarceration in the 20th century.
Pointing out how the system has been used to control and oppress marginalized communities.
Especially Black Americans.
And we see that legacy continuing today.
We do.
In the disproportionate rates of incarceration for Black Americans, in the racial disparities in sentencing.
And the ongoing problem of police brutality.
It's a painful reality.
It is.
And Martin says we can't ignore it.
We have to confront it head on.
We need to acknowledge the systemic nature of the problem and work for real change.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the biblical foundations, the historical context, but let's zoom in on the system itself.
Okay.
How does it actually work?
Right. The nuts and bolts.
Does Martens get into the details?
He does. He breaks down the different components of the system.
Okay.
Examines the roles of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys. Talks about the power dynamics at play.
Right.
And how bias can creep in at every stage.
It's like he's taking us behind the scenes.
Yeah, showing us how the sausage is made.
So what are some of the specific things he raises?
Well, he starts with plea bargaining.
Okay.
Which he describes as kind of a necessary evil.
Okay.
In a system that's just overwhelmed with cases.
Right.
He says it's efficient, but he's concerned about the pressure it puts on defendants to plead guilty.
Even if they're innocent.
Even if they have a strong defense.
So it's like the system is prioritizing expediency over justice.
Sometimes it feels that way.
And it makes me think back to that principle of due process.
Yeah.
Is it really due process if someone feels pressured into giving up their right to a trial?
It's a good question.
It's a question that we need to be asking.
Absolutely.
Okay.
He also talks about jury selection.
Okay.
And how vulnerable it is to bias.
Both conscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
And how that can really affect the fairness of a trial.
It can impact the composition of the jury.
Right. Like, are they really a jury of your peers?
Exactly. And we've seen those high-profile cases where jury selection becomes a huge battle.
Huge, yeah.
It raises real questions about whether the defendant got a fair shake. Martens also gets into the whole issue of evidence.
Okay.
And the challenges of making sure it's reliable.
Right.
He talks about forensic science, eyewitness testimony confessions, and how all of those things can be flawed or misleading.
It's a good reminder that even in a system that's supposed to be objective, human error is always a possibility.
Always.
What else does he talk about?
Sentencing.
Okay.
He points out the disparities that exist.
Like people getting different sentences for similar crimes?
Exactly.
Okay.
He talks about the overuse of incarceration and the impact of mandatory minimums on judges' ability to make decisions.
Yeah, so it takes away their discretion. So it raises questions about what the purpose of punishment is.
Right. Is it about retribution or is it about rehabilitation?
Yeah.
Is it about protecting society? Or is it about inflicting pain?
Those are big questions.
Huge questions.
And then, of course, he revisits the death penalty.
Yeah, he can't avoid that one.
Right.
He explores the arguments for and against it.
The ethical dilemmas it poses, its impact on marginalized communities.
He really covers it all.
It sounds like Martens is giving us a really comprehensive view
He is.
Of the system.
Both the good and the bad.
The strengths and weaknesses.
And he doesn't just leave us there.
No.
He also offers some practical steps that we as Christians can take.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
I'm all ears. Let's talk about that.
Okay, well, he starts by encouraging us to educate ourselves.
Okay.
About the system, both locally and nationally. He says knowledge is power, and the more we understand about how the system works, the better equipped we'll be to advocate for change.
So it's about doing our homework.
Yep.
Not just relying on sound bites or, social media posts.
Right.
Really digging into the issues.
And understanding the nuances.
Yeah. Okay, so education. What else?
Advocacy.
Okay.
He urges us to get involved in advocating for reform. That could mean supporting organizations that are doing good work.
Okay.
contacting our elected officials,
Yeah.
raising awareness about injustices.
So using our voices.
Yeah.
Speaking up for those who might not have a platform.
Exactly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
education, advocacy, what else?
Service.
Okay.
He emphasizes the importance of serving those who are directly affected by the system.
Yeah.
Volunteering with prison ministries,
Yeah.
reentry programs, things like that.
So putting our faith into action,
Absolutely.
showing Christ's love in tangible ways. I love that. It's a good reminder that this isn't just about abstract concepts.
Right.
It's about people.
Yeah, it's about showing up for people who are hurting.
Okay. And then what was the last one?
Voting. He reminds us that we have a voice in the political process, and we need to use it.
Especially in local elections.
Yes, those often have a more direct impact on the criminal justice system.
So thinking about district attorneys, judges, things like that.
Exactly.
So Martens is really calling for a multifaceted approach here.
It is.
Engaging on multiple levels.
It's not just about one thing.
Right. And ultimately it's about changing hearts and minds.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture that truly values justice, mercy, and redemption.
Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into Christian Marten's book, I want to revisit that tension we talked about earlier.
Okay.
The tension between the Christian call to avoid violence and the state's use of force within the criminal justice system. How does Martens reconcile those two seemingly contradictory ideas?
It's a tough one, for sure. But Martens points us back to Romans 13,
Okay.
where Paul talks about submitting to governing authorities.
Mm-hmm.
He reminds us that those authorities have been ordained by God.
So it's not about condoning violence, but recognizing that in a fallen world force might be necessary.
To protect the innocent and uphold justice.
Exactly. But here's the key. Martens argues that that use of force can only be justified when it's motivated by love.
Okay, unpack that for me. What does that actually look like?
It means that the government's use of force should always be a last resort.
Okay.
And it should be guided by a love for both the victim and the offender.
So it's not about revenge
No.
or retribution.
It's about seeking restoration.
And the well-being of the community as a whole.
So we need to be asking ourselves, are our laws, are our policies, are our actions motivated by love?
That's a good question to ask.
It really is. Now, speaking of actions, what does Marten say about punishment itself?
Okay.
Like, what does he consider to be a just punishment from a Christian perspective?
He says that a just punishment should serve several purposes.
Okay.
Deterrence, correction, repentance, and reconciliation.
So it's not just about inflicting pain.
No, there's a bigger picture.
There's a deeper purpose.
It's about deterring future wrongdoing, correcting harmful behavior, prompting genuine repentance.
And ultimately working towards reconciliation.
Yeah, between the offender, the victim, and the community.
That's a really holistic approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot more than just a punitive system.
Right. It requires investing in programs,
Right.
resources.
That support rehabilitation and reintegration.
Okay, so that's kind of the big picture, but I'm curious to hear what Martens has to say about some of the specific punishments used in our system.
Yeah, like incarceration, the death penalty, things like that.
Exactly. What does he think about those?
Well, he's very critical of mass incarceration.
Okay.
He says it's often excessive,
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately affects the poor and minorities, and often fails to address the root causes of crime.
So it's not really solving the problem.
No, it's just creating more problems.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
He suggests exploring a wider range of approaches
Okay.
that focus on rehabilitation and restoration.
So things like restorative justice programs,
Yeah.
community-based sentencing.
Investing in mental health and substance abuse treatment.
So treating people like human beings.
Exactly.
Recognizing that they have needs that need to be met.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now what about the death penalty? That's always a tough one.
It is, and Martens acknowledges the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
He recognizes that there are valid arguments on both sides, even within the Christian community.
So how does he navigate that?
Well, he doesn't shy away from it. He actually dives into both perspectives.
Okay.
He looks at the biblical passages that are often cited in support of capital punishment,
Yeah.
but he also points to the ones that emphasize God's mercy and forgiveness.
So he's presenting a balanced view,
Yeah, he's not trying to tell us what to think,
but he's giving us the tools to think for ourselves
and encouraging us to really wrestle with the issue.
and to let our faith inform our views.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into Christian Marten's Reforming Criminal Justice.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation.
It really has. So to our listeners out there, we hope this has challenged you to think critically about the criminal justice system.
And to consider how your faith can inform your views.
This isn't just an academic exercise. This is about real people, real lives.
And it's up to us to work for a more just and compassionate world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.